is Steph Person, and her presentation is connected in some ways to Claire's, but also very distinct, and has a great title, which is Love Sucks, the Vampire Boyfriend's Perpetuation of Toxic Relationships. Whenever you're ready.
Yes, let me just get the presentation up. Can everybody see it? Good? All right, perfect. So yes, another connection to media and literature. My presentation, Love Sucks, the Vampire Boyfriend's Perpetuation of Toxic Relationships, is an analysis of how visual culture can impact physical culture by way of perpetuating and or framing social relationships. So before I begin, I just wanted to give a bit of a lexicon to ensure that we are all in the same page in terms of language that will be used. So starting with visual culture is any type of culture that could be projected onto either a canvas or screen, things such as magazines, or in our sense for this presentation, film and or movies. Up next is a toxic relationship. I got this definition from psychology website PsychAlive, which says that a toxic relationship is often categorized by repeated mutually destructive modes of relating between a couple. These patterns involve jealousy, possessiveness, desperation, rejection, dominance, and other words, types of manipulation. However, one overwhelming theme in a toxic relationship involves partners' intense draw toward one another despite the pain that they mutually cause. Next, the definition of a love idol. In the context of this presentation, the love idol is oftentimes in a heteronormative context between a man and a woman, most often with the love idol being a man who is essentially the perfect romantic partner for the often female protagonist, who is attentive, gentle, caring, yet also dramatic and mysterious enough to hold the attention of audience and thicken the plot of the story. Next are agents of horror and or romantic agents. So an agent of horror is a character, oftentimes an antagonist in this situation, presented within the horror genre. And a romantic agent is oftentimes either a protagonist or a love interest who is presented within a romantic genre. Finally, the last definition I have is fandom. Fandom is a word combined using fanatic and kingdom to create fandom, which is a community of fans, oftentimes geared towards a visual culture such as a film series or a television show. So the structure of my presentation is going to be beginning with a history and literary background on the vampire boyfriend trope and its creation, followed by a closer look through a case study of Stephenie Meyer's Twilight. Then I'm going to analyze my findings a bit and see what do these findings tell us. And in lieu of a conclusion, I pose a question to end of where do we go from here, and hopefully spark a bit of discussion or contemplation on that idea. So beginning with a history and literary background, we begin in 1897 with Bram Stoker's Dracula, which caused a popularization of the vampire within the horror genre. Historically, the literary purpose of a vampire following this was to serve as a reflection and or metaphor for the fears that plagued society at the time of publication. Then in the 1970s with the Dracula tape by Fred Saberhagen and Interview with a Vampire by Anne Rice, we begin to see a shift within the literary vampires, and texts begin striving for a vampire that is more sympathetic or even tragic, now who's taking the role of the protagonist rather than the brutal antagonist that we are usually accustomed to prior. Then following this in the 1990s, a spin-off of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Angel, is shown to have a movement into visual culture where these sympathetic vampire protagonists begins being shown on the screen as romanticized heroes, and the vampire boyfriend really begins to develop as a trope. Finally, we come to 2008 with the first film of the Twilight saga coming to theaters, Twilight, and we begin to see a full-blown domination of the vampire boyfriend in the young adult field, which creates there a global empire geared toward young women specifically. So a bit on Twilight as the case study to further look at this trope in action. The main characters of this are centered around the couple of Bella and Edward. So Bella is a 17-year-old high school girl who moves across the country to live with her father and living a very ordinary life. She is in every way the relatable, basic teenage character that every girl can relate to and see herself in. And then the love idol that we see within this saga or series is Edward Cullen, a handsome, mysterious, rich high school boy who appearingly is also 17 years old, but in reality, he is a 109-year-old vampire who died during the Spanish influenza. I conducted my research with both a literary analysis, a film analysis, but I also used a lot of data collection via survey and watch parties. And I asked a lot of my watch party to note characteristics of Edward that were positive, things that they'd seen or were drawn to, and a lot of things that come out was that he was a Prince Charming, he was overly gentlemanly, he was challenging yet also caring and gentle when it came to his girlfriend, he was overwhelmingly handsome and the kind of man that you would like to marry. Moving on to my survey, 34.4% of my participants noted that these are the following reasons why they'd watched the film. Either the actors or characters, physical attractiveness, and their allure as a personage within the series. And after the first film was released of Twilight, there was a popularity boom, and it shifted from simply being a book that had a film adaptation to a full-blown global empire. Given that Twilight is a 21st century phenomenon, its influence spread throughout new means, notably the internet. With the founding of websites such as Tumblr, Wattpad, and Archive of Our Own being brought out in the same years from a 2007 to 2008 year span, there was a whole new way for fans to really interact with their favorite books, movies, and the creation of fandoms began. There was a newfound ability for fans to create their own art known as fan art or write their own adaptation of the story. And this created an overwhelming amount of press and publicity where these message boards and online forums allowed people to spread the word about Twilight while also kind of encouraging each other's consumerist practices. When groups of fans or a fandom begins to discuss and connect with each other globally, they're encouraging each other's consumption of not only the media, but the products assumed with it. I involved in this slide a visual of some of the merchandise that was bought by my participants, mostly books and movie tickets to engage closely with the media itself, but as well as posters, jewelry, clothing, and here are some images of some other products. There's soap to be able to smell like Bella and attract one's own Edward through scent, as she does given her boyfriend is a vampire, as well as shirts and necklaces that are branding the fans as being on Team Edward or wanting to find their own Edward and advertising themselves as so that way they'd be identifiable to other fans both in public and online when posting photos. At first glance, Edward Cullen, our love idol, is truly the perfect boyfriend who is protective, caring, sympathetic, overwhelmingly romantic, walking his girlfriend to class and back, carrying her books for her, taking her to romantic picnics, and all of the above. He becomes the obtainable yet unattainable choice. He is dangerous and inhuman, sexy yet non-sexual, noting back to his gentlemanly nature that time and time again is noted. However, on a closer analysis, the reality of this is not quite as it seems. I had asked my survey participants as well as my watch party to note traits that they would associate with a toxic relationship or a toxic partner such as an abuser, as well as some problematic behavior that they had seen in our love idol himself, Edward Cullen. From this, we were able to see a very close link between the traits of an abuser as well as the actions of Edward himself. Beginning with my watch party participants, one of my participants, a 21-year-old man, noted that it was very early on in their relationship where Edward would note that he centered his entire life around Bella, that she was his whole reason for existing, which he and other participants noted as being overly obsessive and possessive behavior of her. there is, throughout the book and the movie, instances of stalking and a lot of overwhelming somnophilic themes and actions. For those who may not know what somnophilic is, it is a philia that is associated with sleep and an unconscious body. Prior to the relationship even starting between the two main characters, he is oftentimes seen welcoming himself into her bedroom late at night, watching her sleep and touching her unconscious body. And this continues throughout the entirety of their relationship over the span of the entire saga. Following on to another problematic or abusive trait of him is that he is overwhelmingly controlling, which goes to tracking her location throughout the series, needing to know where she is, how she's getting there, and who she's associating with. And he gets to the point where he must approve who she is with, whether she's allowed to see her friends or not, and seemingly creates bonds for her by bringing her very close to the members of his family and forcibly isolating her from those who also go to their school, who aren't in with their secret and in the group that the Cullens associate with. He also aggressively gaslights her, as many of my participants have noted, where following an incident where Edward saves Bella's life prior to them even dating, he has pretty much spun the situation that she had hit her head, that she was delusional, didn't know what she was saying, and moves on to threaten her that he will keep her quiet, and that if she tried to tell anyone, no one would believe her anyway. And this trend continues throughout the entirety of their relationship, where he will spin many issues to the point where she becomes convinced very frequently that anything that possibly goes wrong or is tainted in their relationship is all her fault, and that she is the one who is overtly aggressive or possessive or has negative attributes to her. And through all of these different trends in their relationship, it creates a very strong forced dependency. All of the gentlemanly activities from Edward of taking her everywhere she needs to go, being with her all of the time, always being supportive of her, being very protective, creates a very strong dependency between them, which is seen later on in the series. At any point when he leaves or make any notions that he's not going to be there in the same extent that he had been in the past, we see panic attacks, depressive episodes, and even suicide attempts from Bella in attempts to keep him close, which is another abusive tendency on her part that has been created by his manipulation of her emotions and the state of their relationship. So what does this finding and comparison between Edward and an abuser tell us realistically? So I asked my participants in my survey to identify themselves whether they have or have not experienced a toxic and or harmful relationship. And I have 73.9% of my participants noting that yes, they had. 90% of my participants overall were women. And with this statistic, 52% of the 73.9% noted that they were avid Twilight fans who were extremely involved in the fandom as young as 12 years old, given my age range for participants ranges from about 18 to 25 years old. A lot of my participants were in a very impressionable age when the series really came to be and started growing, which shows that there is possibly a link between their viewing of Twilight and growing up looking at these relationships and then going on to now be able to see this in a very different light. So this can be tracked back to the shifting role of horror agents into romantic agents, because even though the vampires have become this sympathetic protagonist or love interest, there is some still elements of horror within the vampires, the blood drinking, the predator-like status, the stalking of their prey, that it just seemingly is concealed now behind a mask of allure and gentlemanly nature in a falsehood of a Prince Charming and happily ever after. And then when this happens, it can get added to the popularity and romanticization of these harmful, possibly even abusive traits and relationships, which then leads to a normalization of these tendencies and enables abusers to hide behind the same mask as these fictionalized vampires, which then in turn normalizes a toxicity in a relationship, and many behaviors become excused due to them having been viewed from a young age in this type of media that is so popular. And the combination of these two will then lead to a perpetuation of overall toxic relationships they pose a danger and or risk for young women who are entering relationships as they're growing older. And the main thing to lead from here, once these findings are unveiled, is where can we truly go from here? As some may know, some may not know, Twilight has evolved into a completely different series by a completely different author. What started off on one of these websites, as I mentioned earlier, as a fan fiction, evolved into what is now 50 Shades of Grey, a very explicit book that very poorly represents a relationship, a sexual relationship that is very deeply rooted in abuse and hierarchy and power dynamics that inherently are unhealthy, that it is geared now towards the women who grew up reading Twilight. So all of the toxicity and behaviors that were originally shown in the first series continue to be perpetuated over and over. And so the where do we go from here, rather than a conclusion, I'd like to just leave this more open as a consideration of where does this problem really start? Is it in the visual culture, or is this in the society that we consume this culture within that is perpetuating these negative instances instead of allowing us to see them in a fictionalized way without bringing them into the physical world from the visual world? And that is all I have for my presentation. So I can move then on to the question part of this presentation.
Thanks very much, Steph. So round of applause and symbols on the screen and however you like to celebrate. Wonderful presentation. Again, we'll take one question or comment before moving on. So anybody who has a question or comment for Steph, love to hear it. Well, look here, it's Professor Erica Del Sandro, surprisingly with a question. As she said, she always has questions. Lovely.
Yeah, I got to be with these projects for so long, and it's great to return to them. So if no one else has a question, I will always happily step up. I'm interested, Steph, in, we talked a lot about your relationship with Twilight, also in our conversations as you were undergoing this project. And I'm really interested now, especially, kind of a semester later, looking back at this project, what surprised you in doing this research? I mean, you had a pretty good idea that the vampire boyfriend trope was like trouble. But you also, I think, told me you had a necklace or something. So I'm just interested in, your relationship with the material and what surprised you as you moved through this project.
So I definitely was growing a very, very big Twilight fan. My parents, who are currently part of the Zoom, can attest that I had shirts and I had posters and I had a jewelry box that has the whole soundtrack that plays to it. I think I still have that in my bedroom, still listen to it. I had a whole trunk, I had almost everything you can imagine I had with Twilight. So I definitely, looking at it, I knew that it was problematic, but I actually didn't realize how deep the links ran. I just wanted to talk more about the eroticism of blood originally and how that is used in a toxic manner. I had started that research actually when I was abroad and was going to initially continue it, but in my findings of my other research, I found some underlying of abusive relationships in this, and as someone who had been exposed to very toxic, borderline abusive relationships in the past, I thought it would be very interesting to further analyze this link. And I think one thing that really did shock me was how much both me and a lot of my participants were able to really recognize this link of, we were exposed to this and we were raised on these things, not realizing how it would impact us later on. And then unfortunately suffering a lot of the consequences of the media proposing and forcing a lot of relationships and ideologies on us that we uncover as being romantic and being sweet and someone caring deeply for us, when in reality it's manipulation and abuse under a guise of a Prince Charming. As is coming in the chat box, fairy tale narratives and things like that have such deeper pasts, I think was definitely the thing that shocked me the most. Was I was really genuinely hoping, actually doing this research, I would find no link, but how severely strong this link was is definitely what both shocked and troubled me a lot when I was doing the research.
Yeah. And kudos for taking it on. I mean, everyone I think did a project that is somehow connected to them personally. And as we talked about a lot in class, like feminist impulses come from here, right? So, but it does take some bravery to think about, well, I have this jewelry box, but I'm still gonna critique this show and this book. So, thank you for that, Steph.
Thanks for the question, Erica, and thanks again for your presentation, Steph. Let us move on. So next up, we have Eric.